The schism of the Copts, the Miaphysite schism, which resulted from the Council of Chalcedon, was not the only schism which resulted from that controversy. The earlier Council of Ephesus led to Christians in the Persian Empire who agreed with Nestorius, apparently, also going into schism. They still exist to this day, the Church of the East, as it's called. They had some other motivations for going into schism, I suppose, just as the Miaphysites were motivated by the insult to the Egyptian Christians of Constantinople claiming second place in the church. The Persian Christians were encouraged to go into schism because up until the conversion of Constantine, the Persian Empire had treated Christians relatively kindly because they were greatly persecuted in the Roman Empire, and as the Persians didn't like the Romans, they thought anyone the Romans hate that much must have something to be said for them, so they left the Christians alone. Once, however, Constantine converted to Christianity and slowly Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, more and more associated with the very fact of being Roman. Constantine had emphasized that it was in the reign of Augustus, the first emperor, that Christ had come into the world and that the Roman Empire had been created, as it were, as a vessel for Christianity to be poured into. So Romanness and Christianness became very closely associated. As a result, the Persian government became increasingly unenthusiastic and eventually inclined towards persecution of its Christian population. So perhaps, I fear, it was with some relief that the Persian Christians embraced the errors of Nestorius and went into schism from the church inside the Roman Empire, as this made life considerably easier for them with the Persian authorities. Another important development at the end of the 5th century, which powerfully affects the 6th century and later epochs, is the career of St. Benedict of Nursia. Up until this time, with some impressive exceptions, it was the Eastern Empire which was very much the theatre, the location of the great monastic founders and teachers. And only slowly and derivatively did this wisdom trickle back to the West. However, with St. Benedict, a titan of monasticism emerged in the Western Empire. He was born in 480, just 4 years after the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, in the city of Nurcia, up in the Umbrian mountains. And he was born to a local Roman governor, post-Roman governor, I suppose, at this point, as was his twin sister, of course, Saint Scholastica. And he pursued studies in the city of Rome, but was alienated by the worldliness of the academic culture there, went off to become a hermit. He became so famous for his miracles and his asceticism and his wisdom that he was invited to become the abbot of a monastery, who eventually found that his regime was too rigorous for them and tried to poison him. This was unsuccessful. Benedict blessed the cup and it exploded, as saints do these things. And but eventually he founded many monasteries of his own, and his rule for monasteries became very celebrated and would ultimately become the norm for all monasticism in the West, starting in the late 8th century. Now, as we mentioned last time, this early period in the 6th century was an Indian summer for the Roman senatorial aristocracy, because they were left alone to run Italy by the Ostrogoths, and they weren't pushed around or told what to do by the emperor, because he was in schism from Rome because of this dubious compromise sponsored by Acacius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, in order to try and reconcile the Copts with the rest of the Eastern Church. This compromise was promoted and accepted by the Emperor Anastasius, who was the emperor at the end of the 5th century, beginning of the 6th century. He's quite a significant figure for various reasons. He gave the title of consul, an honorary consulate, to the Frankish king Clovis, which was a sign of the approval, the imperial approval of Frankish rule of the now lost province of Gaul. It's important to understand that almost all the western provinces, though ruled by barbarians, in most cases those barbarians saw themselves as being franchisees, essentially, of the emperor in Constantinople. So they still had a view of the legitimately governed part of the world as being governed by the Roman emperor and those who received approval from him. This is a very important part of the Christian worldview for many, many centuries. Anastasius is also significant because of a letter that was written to him by Pope Gelasius at the end of the 5th century, in which Gelasius lays out his understanding of the proper relationship between the temporal and the spiritual power. Both are instituted by God, but one, of course, he doesn't go into this detail, but one, the temporal through nature, the other through grace and revelation. But the sacred authority of priests, as Gelasius puts it, is superior to the royal power and must answer for its moral conduct, the moral conduct of the temporal power, and therefore is superior to it. And this Gelasian theory, or Gelasian diarchy as it's called, would also become the standard understanding of the relationship between temporal and spiritual power in Christian history. It's important to understand this is completely novel and completely derived from divine revelation and unique to Christianity. The idea that the central beliefs and forms of worship of a society should be governed by a completely separate sovereign authority that's immune from the authority of the temporal rulers is a distinctive Christian concept derived from the supernatural, surpassing character of the end for which the church was instituted. It's not something which is obvious to people outside of the church. So when secularized Westerners try to apply this concept of church and state or religion and state to other cultures, it usually goes pretty badly wrong because it's simply not in their DNA, because it's, as I say, derived from uniquely Christian teachings. Eventually, the relationship between the Ostrogoths in Italy and the Catholic indigenous Romans began to break down. And the reason for this was that in 517, the Emperor Anastasius, who was privately a Miaphysite and who publicly supported the Henoticon, the dubious reunion document of Patriarch Acacius, he died, and he was succeeded by the captain of his palace guard, an elderly gentleman called Justin. Justin was of peasant origin and possibly illiterate, but he came from the Illyrian provinces of the Eastern Empire, or the Roman Empire as it was now with the fall of the Western Empire, and which were Latin-speaking and were more viscerally connected to the papacy. And Justin was very uninterested by maintaining the Acacian Schism and immediately wanted to make peace with Rome exclusively on Roman terms, on papal terms. And so he invited Pope Hormisdas to lay down the terms on which the schism would end. Hormisdas produced a document called a Formula of Hormisdas, in which the Eastern bishops, an oath which all Eastern bishops were required to profess, in which they unqualifiedly subjected themselves to the infallible papacy. This document is very uncomfortable for the Eastern Orthodox because it's very clearly teaching exactly the same doctrine of papal primacy and infallibility as would subsequently be defined in 1870 by the First Vatican Council. So it's worth looking it up. All the Eastern bishops took it. There's some suggestion that a few of them may have tweaked the formula or tried to avoid it, run off to the lavatory at the last minute or something. But this isn't really very important because they remained in communion with the Pope thereafter, and they remained in communion with the bishops, the vast majority, who had definitely taken it. So they clearly accepted that this doctrine was not heretical. So whether some of them tried to elude taking the oath doesn't really impact its doctrinal importance. Justin had a very impressive and talented nephew called Peter Sabatius, and he was keen to groom Peter to become his successor as emperor, and he gave him a lavish education, and Peter added to his name Justinianus of Justin, to associate himself with the emperor. And when Justin died, Justinian, as he was now known, his nephew, would succeed him and become arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest Roman emperor in the whole long history of the empire. But in the meantime, the ending of the schism was causing very serious problems in Italy. The reason for this was that Theodoric had never suspected his Roman provincial subjects from secretly wanting to get rid of him and return to direct administration by the emperor, because he knew that they disapproved of the emperor because he was a Miaphysite or a Miaphysite sympathizer. But once the schism was ended, of course, that was no longer the case. And Theodoric, who had up to this point ruled rather benignly, began to descend into paranoia about what the real intentions of his subjects might be. And one of the most important and famous of the victims of this paranoia was the great Roman senator, master of the offices, kind of head of government, brilliant philosopher, and brilliant defender of the Catholic faith, and ultimately martyr, Saint Manlius Severinus Boethius, St. Manlius Anicius Severinus Boethius, usually just known as Boethius. He, knowing of the decline of Greek literacy in the West, Boethius, who was a brilliant philosopher, determined to translate the complete works of Plato and the complete works of Aristotle into Latin, and to write commentaries on them all, and to defend the Catholic faith in a series of treatises against the most prevalent heresies of his day, and ultimately to show that when you eliminated from Plato and Aristotle's thought all those elements that conflicted with Orthodox Catholic doctrine, that what was left would perfectly reconcile with each other and with the faith, producing the perfect synthesis of philosophy and theology, of natural reason and of divine revelation. This is essentially the project which the great doctors of the 13th century would finally complete, preeminently St. Thomas Aquinas. Boethius was never able to complete it because Theodoric's paranoia led him to denounce Boethius as a traitor, as someone who was conspiring with the Eastern Emperor, and ultimately to execute him. While he was awaiting execution, Boethius wrote an amazing golden treatise on the reason why suffering is permitted by God in the world and the purposes which it serves. This is known as the Consolation of Philosophy. It's one of the great works of Western civilization and of the Catholic tradition, and everybody should read it. In the meantime, Theodoric sent the Pope John I to Constantinople to try and persuade the emperor to repeal a law which he had passed banning any non-Catholic from holding office in the empire. This implicitly destroyed the legitimacy of Theodoric's regime, because he was ruling Italy as the representative of the emperor, and he was an Arian. Pope John tried his best. He was able to get some of the provisions mitigated. His reception in Constantinople was spectacular. Here, the Emperor Justin greeted him at the frontiers of the city. He prostrated himself in front of him, and he had the Pope crown him again as emperor in the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Constantinople. People often think that the later Frankish king Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor in 800 AD, was the first emperor to be crowned by the Pope, but in fact it was the Emperor Justin was the first to receive this honour. However, Theodoric was not happy with the progress that Pope John had made, and when he returned to Italy, he placed him under arrest, and he later died there, and is venerated as at the least a confessor for the faith, arguably a martyr. When Justinian succeeded his uncle Justin as emperor, he embarked on a dramatic program of restoration of the Roman Empire. He achieved four very important things, which mark him out as I suggested, one of, if not the greatest of all Roman emperors. He managed to double the size of the empire, reconquering many of the western provinces, almost the whole of North Africa, almost all the way to Morocco, the whole of Italy, although that campaign took a very long time and was very bloody, and a significant chunk of Spain, so that he got within spitting distance of once again encompassing the Mediterranean with Roman arms, although not quite. He also built the largest church on earth, the largest covered space on earth for many centuries, the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia was actually designed by mathematicians rather than architects, and so it has a sort of perfect symmetry and perfection to it. The dome, which made it the largest covered space on earth, is supported by a ring of smaller arches, and the interior of the dome was completely covered in gold mosaic. The result was that at certain times of day, when the light shone in through the windows under the dome, the top of the church would be flooded with light reflected off the gold mosaics, and it would look as if the dome was floating on a kind of cushion of light above the building itself. Justinian didn't want to go into the church while it was being constructed because he wanted to see it in its glorious final form as intended. And so he was taken to the main entrance when it was all completed, and the architects had the doors opened for him to walk in, and he was overwhelmed by the splendor of the site of this church and exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." And the liturgy of the Hagia Sophia, of the Byzantine Rite as it became known, would become famous throughout the Middle Ages for its glory and beauty. And simply that fact itself would bring about the conversions of whole peoples in later centuries, as we will see. The liturgy for most of the year in Byzantium was conducted according to the what's called the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, attributed to the great father and doctor of the church, who we spoke about earlier, who had been Bishop of Constantinople at the beginning of the 5th century. During Lent, the Liturgy of St. Basil is used instead, Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia, another one of the great Eastern fathers. The reason probably that these two figures are considered the authors of that liturgy is because it probably didn't have a distinctive liturgical tradition of its own, being only a suffragan of Heraclea prior to the refounding of Byzantium as the capital of the Roman Empire by Constantine. In fact, during weekdays in Lent, the Byzantine Rite uses something called the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified, where the Eucharist is not itself consecrated, but rather the already consecrated hosts are consumed. And this liturgy is attributed by the Byzantines themselves to Gregory the Great, the brilliant pope who would be elected at the end of the century, and who, previous to his election as pope, served a number of years as papal ambassador in Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia, which the famous cultural historian Kenneth Clark described as one of the two most beautiful buildings ever built, unfortunately now a mosque due to later developments, he codified the whole of Roman law into the great Codex Juris Civilis, which would become the absolute standard of Roman law in later centuries. It had proportionately less influence on the West because the Western provinces, even the reconquered ones, were not held on to quite long enough for it to have a full influence straight away. But the text was rediscovered in the 11th century and became completely normative for mainland Western Europeans from that point onwards. And he also held the 5th Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Constantinople, at which he tried to reconcile the Copts and other Miaphysites with the church by a more fulsome and detailed condemnation of Nestorius and also other theologians who were associated with him, and a more complete and unqualified endorsement of the theology of Saint Cyril. Unfortunately, this didn't succeed in the long term, partly because his wife, who was extremely influential on him, very impressive figure, a former prostitute in fact, the Empress Theodora, was quite personally committed to Miaphysite doctrine and helped to keep the Miaphysite movement in existence, and even arrange for them to ordain their own line of bishops, and that really did confirm its continued existence in separation from the Catholic Church, tragically. The relationship between the Pope in the later days of Justinian and the Emperor was quite controversial. Pope Vigilius, he had been introduced as Pope after Rome was reconquered from the Ostrogoths by Justinian's armies, and was thought of as something of the creature of Justinian. In fact, the deposition of his predecessor for suspected Gothic sympathies was rather questionably legal. But in the end, Vigilius was reluctant to endorse the condemnation of some of the figures that Justinian wanted to see condemned at the Second Council of Constantinople, because they had not been condemned while they were alive, and a lot of Westerners thought that by condemning people who had not been condemned by the Council of Chalcedon, it would cast aspersions on the legitimacy of the Council of Chalcedon, which was certainly not Justinian's intention, and that would therefore reflect badly on the authority of the popes. So Vigilius refused to attend the council, even though he was present in Constantinople. He barricaded himself into the papal embassy there and later into the church in Chalcedon, where the Council of Chalcedon had been held. Chalcedon is very close to Constantinople. He held out all the way through the council, and his name was even removed from the prayers said by the bishops there for suspected heresy. So it's one of the most extreme cases of conflict with a pope for doctrinal reasons. Finally, at the very end of proceedings, when the council had concluded, Vigilius reversed his position and ratified the decisions of the council, rendering them infallible. So Vigilius had previously rejected this idea in a constitution, which, however, he only addressed to and sent to the Emperor Justinian himself. Justinian refused to open this constitution and sent it back unopened, and therefore it remained unpromulgated, and by that razor-thin margin was the doctrine of papal infallibility preserved. In the latter years of the 6th century, the various successors of Justinian fought manfully to try and preserve his reconquests, and they found this particularly difficult because the empire and the whole Mediterranean world, but particularly the empire, had been afflicted by an appalling plague, possibly worse even than the Black Death, which descended around the year 540 and seems to have killed a very large proportion of the population of the empire and greatly weakened the revived Roman Empire, though Justinian, being something of a genius, managed to continue on through these calamities. But it still left it much more difficult to preserve his reconquests, especially when a new barbarian people, the Lombards, also, alas, Arians, poured into Italy just after Justinian's death and caused the authorities in Constantinople to lose control of a large part of the province, never fully to regain it. Nevertheless, all the way to the end of the century, the Emperor Maurice was still fighting manfully, successfully, but with difficulty, to keep the revived empire in possession of its far-flung territories. In the year 590, the greatest single pope, probably, in the whole history of the papacy, removing from consideration St. Peter himself, Gregory the Great was elected. And his achievements are very many and difficult to enumerate. He is, of course, is generally to him that is attributed both the Gregorian chant, as it's called, and the kind of codification and completion of the classic form of the Roman Rite, which it retained broadly all the way down until the middle of the 20th century. He also became a doctor of the Church. He's the fourth of the most prestigious great Latin fathers. His commentary, his allegorical commentary on the Book of Job, is one of the great works of the Latin patristic age. And unlike the other Latin fathers, because Rome was part of the empire ruled from Constantinople at that time, his works were translated into Greek, and he was by far the most influential of the Latin fathers in the Eastern Church in the latter days of the Middle Ages, of the patristic period and into the Middle Ages. It's to him that we owe the knowledge of the life of St. Benedict. His dialogues, book 2 of his dialogues, is completely devoted to that. And also he is responsible for the Christianity of the entire English-speaking world, because when he was abbot of the monastery of St. Andrew, which he founded in Rome. He was wandering around the streets with his prior, St. Augustine, not of Hippo, different St. Augustine, and they saw some slaves, some young men who had been enslaved and taken from Britain, which was now overrun by the Anglo-Saxon pagan barbarians. They were uncharacteristically pasty and blonde for the Mediterranean world, and Gregory asked, "Who are these?" And he was told they are Angles. He famously replied, "Non Angli sed Angeli," not Angles but angels. Where in Anglia are they from? The slave dealer replied, "Deira," which is Yorkshire. And he said, "We must save them, Deira, from the wrath of God." And so he wanted to go himself to try and convert the Anglo-Saxons, but as he was elected Pope, this proved impossible, so he sent Augustine instead. And his mission, combined with the mission of St. Columba's followers, who was in Scotland. St. Columba was an Irishman. Ireland was already Christian because the Roman Briton Patrick in the previous century, who had been abducted by Irish pagan pirates and had eventually been sent back by visions to Ireland. He, a Welshman essentially, Patrick, had converted already the Irish, who'd never been part of the Roman Empire, to Christianity. The Irish church became very vibrant, and Columba, one of their great saints, ended up in exile in the Scottish island of Iona and began to convert the pagans of north of the old Roman province to Christianity. And eventually missionaries from Iona came south to convert the north of what is now England, and the missionaries from Rome sent by Gregory came to Kent in the far south of what is now England. And when the two joined together, the entire country was converted. And so in the following centuries, the Christianity of England and Ireland particularly would be among the most vibrant, zealous and erudite of anything in the Western Empire, well, the former Western Empire, having quite a transformative influence on the subsequent course of its history.